I worked in education for a long time, so like I know what it's like to get the federal money and then to have to do all the requirements and whatnot. And you do all the requirements, but none of it is really checking to see if it actually worked. It's like, did you do this thing? Did you hire this kind of guy? Did you have this check-in process? Did you have this annual review, etc.? And man, I gotta tell you, that doesn't sound like that much money for given what you guys were doing. What were some of your policy goals? And were you able to have success with them? What are your takeaways from that experience? What are you proud of? What do you regret?
Well, one of the programs under my purview was the nation's biggest homelessness program at the federal level. It was about $2 billion, a little bit more than $2 billion a year. So what had happened under the Obama administration is they were trying to transform homelessness aid so that you simply give people free housing indefinitely. There's no requirements for substance abuse treatment, mental health, spiritual direction, workforce training, anything like that. You can't require that. You just have to give them free housing indefinitely. And that's the direction they wanted to go. A little bit of a problem there is it doesn't quite work. You actually need to deal with the real issue of that's going on inside of that person's heart in order to get them better. And that requires having some kind of requirement, such as, counseling, mental health, the things I just mentioned. So when we try to go and put those things back in, it was like you're trying to kill puppies and kittens or something. They just come at you saying, "Oh man, how could you be so heartless? How could dare you put requirements on them? Oh, that's so mean." And so it was a really big fight to actually get things moved in the direction of, because we care about people and we actually want the person to improve and get better as a human being. We don't just want to keep them hooked on the government forever, with the government paying their rent for the next, 15 years. Apparently that's you're being a monster if you want that. So that was one of the biggest fights. And, that was not necessarily a happy ending because they ended up putting language in the appropriation that we couldn't change the requirements, which is the first time they've ever done that as far as we know. And it shows you, on the one hand, they were under threat, which is good. What I call the poverty industrial complex. They really saw us as a threat, and they had to go and do these great lengths to stop what we were doing. But they were able to get some of the Republicans even to drink the Kool-Aid on this. So that was an example of something that we fought. But now the fight is continuing. There are folks working with the Congress to get this stuff changed. So it's continuing in a different realm over in the legislative branch. But we're glad to be part of the momentum on that. So that is a big issue that we looked at. Another one along similar lines is you might be familiar with the Section 8 program, which is where you can get a voucher every month which pays your rent. Basically, you pay only a very small amount or nothing, and the federal government will pick up the tab on your rent if you make less than a certain amount. And we wanted to have work requirements so that if you're an able-bodied adult, in other words, if you're not elderly or disabled, but you're an able-bodied adult capable of work, then you have to work in order to get the free rent. That's another thing where, they think you're trying to kill puppies and kittens if you want people to have to do some work to get their free rent, because, we care about people. We want the person to have the dignity of getting money in their pocket every 2 weeks and realize how that really develops them as a human being, give them some self-sufficiency and move them up. That's what we want to do. We're not just about keeping people hooked, but even that is like pulling teeth to be able to get that through. So there's just so much momentum in the system to keep it the way it is. And the poverty industrial complex has got their hooks in many of the lawmakers and the news media, and they've got many advocacy organizations. But that is also a fight that's continuing in other fronts with the legislative branch. And, God willing, if I get in there and many good folks get in there in November of 22, we can start to tackle these at the legislative level and kind of go around some of the entrenched momentum there. So those are just a couple of the fronts that we looked at that we're seeing some fruit on now. We're seeing success on as the work continues now. But yeah, it takes a lot. I think this is why the left was so freaked out in 2020. I think they realized what was going to happen if Trump got in there again. And this is when you saw the mass mail-in ballots and things. Right. We were getting our bearings and things quite extensively as time went on. So, yeah, those are just some examples of the kind of fights there are.
What an interesting story you're telling me there. I recently was a Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute, and we did an extensive deep dive into the founding documents, the contemporaneous state constitutions, and the letters of the founders, and the political philosophy and the moral conditions required for freedom and such. And the founders were very, very clear that government had a role in encouraging moral and virtuous behavior, because the
Yes.
republic, as they created it, could not exist without a moral and virtuous people. And
Yes.
I think about that. I think about, I believe it's Aristotle that basically says that life is activity. Like, activity and action is life. I've been known to say that, God created the world, the creation is the vibe of the universe, right? Like, if you build and create, if you do things, if you grow, you will align yourself to the energy of the universe. And then when you take all those big ideas and then you look at them on a very concrete, specific policy level, and you see the difference between seeing someone in crisis and just handing them stuff, thinking that is going to make a difference. Whereas the alternative view is to help them become and encourage them to become more moral and virtuous and more aligned to the energy of the universe, more aligned to action is life. And mood follows movement too, right? So all these things that you can encourage are positive benefits to people. Is there, and have you feel this? This is meta. This is really big struggle between how do you help somebody? You just give them stuff, or you encourage them to be a better person. What role? I think we know the answer here, but I'd like to hear you just explain a little bit more. What role does the federal government in particular play in creating moral and virtuous people, and what is its responsibility in that dynamic, in the sense that if you're just giving people stuff, maybe you're actually hurting them spiritually?
Yes, I think there's a very good point there. It seems like a lot of folks have accepted the idea that throwing money at a problem is how you solve the problem, when in most cases that is not at all true. So I think because of the education system, which is controlled by folks who have that ideology, that's what we get indoctrinated in going through the education system. And so a lot of people just take it for granted that if you want to solve a problem like homelessness, just give more money to it. Well, homelessness spending has increased by something like 2 or 3-fold over the past 10 years, but yet the problem is getting worse. And so it's just one example of where spending more money hasn't solved the problem. Same with Black home ownership. There's a lot of talk about the Black home ownership rate is much lower than other groups. Well, it's about the same today as it was in the 60s. Even though there's been trillions of dollars in spending on various programs and various housing programs and whatnot, it really hasn't gone up. And so there's something really missing there. And it is difficult for the politicians to wrap their head around this, because they think they'll get attacked for being not compassionate if they cut spending on these, when in fact it is compassionate because you're actually moving towards something that works. And so that's part of the dilemma here, is that even among many Republicans, they don't want to be seen as a guy that cut something, because the optics look bad, even if what they're doing actually will end up helping more people. Here's a good example. You take the Section 8 rent vouchers, right? You give out tons of these vouchers every year, and what that does is it drives up demand, because there are now more people who can afford to rent. So that increases your demand. Well, when you increase demand, you also increase prices if the supply stays the same. So now you're increasing prices at the low end of the rental market, and all those poor people who don't have a voucher are now paying more for rent because of the Section 8 vouchers that are going out. And if you add up the total value of the extra money they're paying, it actually is a greater loss than the benefit from the people getting the vouchers. So this is just one example of how this program, which many people assume helps, actually has really serious unintended consequences and actually hurts more poor people than it helps. And you go through program after program, you see a similar dynamic of where if you just look at the basic math and the science there's not a lot of evidence that these work at the very best, or at the worst case, they actually hurt people. So yeah, I think what you're saying is exactly right. But the problem is, if you're a lobbyist group or if you're the poverty industrial complex, they're building homelessness housing in California for sometimes $600,000 per unit for homelessness housing. And you better believe that some of the developers, underwriters, syndicators, lawyers, the middlemen are getting a cut. And they're the ones who will often advocate for more homelessness spending. Oh, how dare you, heartless person? How could you not want more spending for the homeless? Oh, you call yourself a Christian? So you increase the spending, and then you get the $600,000 per unit homelessness housing, where some folks are making out on like bandits on it. So that is kind of where we're at right now. And you're right. It's not producing virtue. It's not helping the people that it's intending to help, but it's helping somebody. And as long as they have this message of, I'm compassionate, I care about people, that's why we have to increase spending. As long as people are willing to buy that, it makes it easy for them to keep doing that.
Indeed. I worked for many years in real estate development. I've done all kinds of stuff. I've done urban infill. I've done rehabs, multifamily, condo, commercial interiors. I've done greenfield development in the suburbs, delivering lots to builders and such. And I know, as soon as you said $600,000 units, I know where all the cuts are going. You've got a development fee, you've got a construction management fee, you've got a project management fee, then you've got your regulatory fee, the people that handle all the regulations around it. Then you've got all the lawyers for every single one of those people involved on everything. Then all the way down. And I know that the tradesmen are doing good there, but they have a funny way of doing contracts as well. It's not the carpenter that's making out. It's the guy that hires the carpenters, who bids on the jobs, who's got the guy in his company who is there as a token to get the minority element of the low income housing requirements. And man, it is a flippin' scam. It is a flippin' scam.
Yeah.
And the market itself would be able to deliver a adequately constructed and priced unit if and only we would let the market do its thing. It's one of these, it goes along with one of these contradictory notions people have, which is that if you put a ceiling on rent, that you're going to make things better for everybody. But when you cap rents, you decrease supply, decrease quality, and you have people struggling to find housing at all. So what this says to me is that we need to simplify. And man, the complexity that we've created in this society is just a ticking time bomb that we're seeing exploding actually all over the place. And there's even more reservoirs of this complexity that's going to just explode. But as a congressman, and man, I have so many things I also want to get back to here on real estate, but as a congressman, how would you propose simplifying things and stripping out some of this complexity that's leading to these negative or unexpected, maybe even expected, but let's say suboptimal outcomes? How do we make it easier to collect the money from the people, centralize it to the government, and send it back out? Maybe that's a problem in and of itself. What do you think, John?
Well, I think cutting red tape is a thing we got to do. For example, I remember at HUD, I'll never forget, we had a gentleman come in who builds homelessness housing, and he could build it actually for a really low cost. And these are pretty decent units you could put folks in, and you could have the services for them, job training, mental health, etc. And he was doing it for much lower than people getting government subsidies. And so the problem is, if he was going to apply for a government grant, like from HUD, for example, the red tape was so huge that it would cost like 3 times more to do the unit, because you got to have a certain type of lighting, a certain type of insulation, you got to have a certain number of parking spaces, a certain thickness of the walls, and you got to have no more than X number of people per room, and get all this red tape in there, and it ends up becoming cost prohibitive. And so I think we've really got to look at reducing the red tape for what it takes to get money for some of these programs. Now, you don't want them using it on things like Planned Parenthood, so you got to have some level of guardrails to make sure the money is being used on what it's supposed to be used for. But when it comes to a lot of the requirements on there, again, it comes to a situation where if you got to use the most expensive type of light bulb, that's going to drive up the cost when you might not even need that. If you're dealing with poorer populations, you want them to have a place that is decent and livable, but it's not going to be the Hilton. It's just got to be a place that's livable while they move their way up in society. So, but I think there is a mentality that everywhere's got to be the Hilton. And so that ends up really skewing things. So we can really reduce some of the red tape, make it easier to build good quality stuff, which, look, the American people are very innovative. I have no doubt whatsoever. You get a bunch of guys together from around the country and say, let's build some housing for the homeless that is good stuff and that is cheap. You will get answers. We've got people that are so creative when it comes to building stuff. I have total faith in the people. But if we can get the red tape out of there so we can just empower that innovation that's out there in our culture, I think that's the thing you got to tackle. It's just the bureaucratic red tape stuff.